Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm David Willey. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's professorial inaugural lecture. An especially warm welcome to those of you who are visitors to Bournemouth University. We are delighted to see you here this evening. A professorial inaugural lecture is, as it suggests, a lecture given early in a professorial career at Bournemouth University on a topic of relevance and interest to the professor's area of academic interest. During the course of this academic year, we plan to hold 6 such events, of which this is the first. We were extremely pleased as a university when, during the summer, Anthony Lilly accepted our invitation to become a visiting professor. I'm therefore delighted to be introducing him to you tonight as he delivers his inaugural lecture. Anthony is Chief Executive of Magic Lantern Productions, a Peabody and BAFTA award-winning interactive media production company which specialises in broadband and multi-platform media. In a marketplace where most of his competitors are driven by the tyranny of modern technology, Magic Lantern is a company led by the art of storytelling. We very much look forward to hearing Anthony's insights this evening on the rapidly changing landscape of the media industry. Magic Lantern was established in 1996, and its clients now include Channel 4, BBC, Guardian Media Group, Google, Tiscali, and many other household names in today's creative media industry. Anthony is a member of the Content Board of the regulator Ofcom. He's an associate of the Arts Council England and is an advisor on future media to the Department for Children, Schools and Families. From 2000 to 2006, Anthony was Vice Chair of the Producers Alliance for Cinema and Television and Chair of its Interactive Media Policy Group. He has advised many government departments and regularly gives keynote speeches and masterclasses, including at the British Film Institute, the Royal Television Society, the Edinburgh International Television Festival, and Digital Britain Forum. He's written for the Guardian newspaper, Future Media magazine, Financial Times, Broadcast magazine, Televisual, and regularly contributes to broadcast media. In 2008, Anthony was awarded an OBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours List for his services to the media industry. Just last night, Anthony was recognised and awarded a prestigious Royal Television Society Award for innovation. Following a law degree at Oxford University, Anthony started his professional life in theatre as a venue manager, a producer, a lighting designer and director. He's a great friend of Bournemouth University and particularly of the Media School. Anthony's lecture is entitled Paying Attention, the Changing Value of Media in the Internet Age. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Anthony Lilly.
Thank you. This is where I wander out and let down that introduction. Thank you very much. It's great to be back at Bournemouth, this time with the professor's hat on. It's especially great to have one of my first mentors in the room, Roger Lawton, who was the first person who got me down the train tracks from Waterloo. So it's nice to be back, Roger, years later. And thank you for the first invitation, and thank you for the invitation this evening. If you haven't read your homework, the tiny, tiny illegible writing up there, I'll read it for you. The title and the sort of topic of the lecture is essentially about attention and about how getting people to pay for attention is kind of the pivotal question for all the media industries going forwards, and broadly speaking, how some of them are reacting to that challenge and how others are taking it more easily in their stride. This is the inaugural, so it's got to be the first lecture. So I suspect it will be more full of questions than it is of answers, which makes it a pretty good model and a pretty good reflection of my professional and daily life, particularly as the father of 2 children under 3, for whom the question why is now absolutely paramount. So I started on this slide here defining the word attention, or I didn't. William James, who is the author of the kind of default book about psychology for undergraduates did, which is the tiny writing you can't read. So it says everyone knows what attention is. It's the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seem several simultaneous possible objects or trains of thought. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others. And it is a condition which has a real opposite in the confused, dazed, scatterbrained state, which in French is called distraction and Zerstreuheit in German. If you now think I'm even slightly clever because I managed to read that out and it had some French and some German in it, what you should know is that's the top of the article in Wikipedia when you type in attention. So what made me look a bit clever to my dad actually was really easy because it just involved typing into a search engine the word attention. What made me slightly less doltish than perhaps I am is the ability to decide that that was a relevant quote for my speech. So most of this evening is going to be about how you know useful things from not useful things, how you know valid things from invalid things, and then how you try and decide what you should pay attention to. Because actually it's dead easy to get a quote from William James. It's actually really easy to get one from Proust. I'm quite fond of chucking a Proust quote on the screen. I didn't make it past the second paragraph of À la recherche du temps perdu. I'm not expecting to anytime soon, but if I want to look clever, it's dead easy to get Proust out to do it for me. The skills we need going forwards and the skills that media companies need are about understanding where attention is allocated, why it's allocated there, and what to do to try and create what you might call attention traps. Some bits of the media know how to do that better than others. So what is this paying attention idea about? Well, paying attention is about choices. Most of what I'm going to talk about this evening, which will range lightly across bits of economics that I picked up at the regulator at Ofcom, where economics is a kind of, is it a religion? It's a dismal science, definitely. Sometimes it's a religion. So I will range across a bit of economics through to things I actually know something about from bitter experience of mainly getting them wrong as a professional in the media, through to some things I really care about, like learning, like actually of all things art and creativity. But I'm going to start with choices. To pay attention, you've got to make choices, and choices are based on information. They're based on what's presented in front of you. Not all of them. Sometimes you just react. Sometimes you don't think about things at all. But in the context of media, most choices are based on some kind of information. I'm going to talk a lot about what I think are misreadings of the place of information, the importance of information in our society, and particularly about some people I'm going to call information fundamentalists, who are the people at the more geeky end of the spectrum that I work with, who believe that if you just have enough information, good things will necessarily result. And there's a great history of these kind of technological utopianists. If you read a book called The Victorian Internet by Tom Standage, about the arrival of the telegraph, you will read wonderful pronouncements about how the ability to communicate more quickly was going to end all war, when in fact it just made it a great deal more efficient to decide where you should send your troops, which is not quite what the utopians thought. And the problem about that is that technologies are used by people. Choices are made by people. And of course they are. Unfortunately, we don't behave in a terribly rational way quite a lot of the time, and we seldom use technologies for what the inventors originally envisaged. But that doesn't stop information fundamentalism, and it doesn't stop the valid and measurable rise of information. We've heard phrases, the information society, the networked economy, these kind of jargon phrases that you hear a great deal about the world we now live in, the digital world of information that surrounds us. And we've heard about those topics essentially from a sort of category of people who are predominantly selling a vision of the future, but doesn't make some of these things untrue. My phrase for the internet this evening, I'm not going to use it a lot, will be to describe it as the ultimate copying machine. Everything the internet does is about creating copies. Your email is copied multiple times between when you press send and the microsecond or however long it is that it takes to arrive in your computer. Every file that is shared across the internet is copied multiply, perfectly, in something approaching real time and in something approaching no marginal cost, zero marginal cost. What we've invented is the perfect copying machine to a large extent, and the perfect copying machine wouldn't be any use if it wasn't good at spreading copies around the place. What we haven't yet understood is the implications of the perfect copying machine for the old way of doing things. Or some people have understood it, and some people are grappling with it at the moment. The second thing we're grappling with, I believe, is a shift from a world in which the power of distribution, the power of creation lay with large groups, large organisations, to a position now where, as a creator of media, I think about what I call the focus group of one. The one person, the person formerly known as the audience, a member of that group, who is turning up at my website, playing my game, interacting with my proposition, my work in some shape or form. The reason I think about them is because the internet isn't made up of audiences that turn up at 7:30 every Tuesday regardless. It doesn't respect time, it doesn't respect geography, and so every user, every person arriving reacts individually to my work. That didn't matter so much when they were consuming media work. It matters a great deal when they're making choices based on information about what to do with it. Most web pages I make, and I've made hundreds of millions of them in my career now, are seen by almost nobody for almost no time at all. That's quite a levelling notion as a creative. Most people turn up to most websites, and what they're looking for is the next thing to do to allow them to leave. That's very, very different to a notion of keeping people embedded within a linear story. It's very different to my original world, working in the theatre, where generally speaking the act of departing is quite a big statement. The act of departing a website is a default thing. It's what you do. And creating in that space is a very difficult and very different place to creating in the linear spaces, which are, by the way, just as difficult but in different ways. What I'm driving at here is that the skills of one are not necessarily transferable to the other. The good news is just about anybody under 28, 29 doesn't see the difference between those two things in any case, and therefore will be shortly taking over jobs like mine. And that's great news, and as long as I can retire before that happens, please. The group of people who believe this stuff more than anything are the people I've referred to already, the information fundamentalists. People who believe that if there's just more stuff, if there's more information, if there's more computing power, it will automatically result in better societies, in better life, in better experience. Now, I may just not be able to do the maths here. I may just not be able to think on the long term. But I read a bit of science fiction, and I read a lot of other things, and I can foresee a conceptual world in which we have sentient machines and conscious computers. I can foresee all that stuff, kind of hoping to be long dead before we get there. But I can't see the maths that far. I'm not good enough at that. I'm in this kind of bridging world, as I believe we all are, between messy, irrational, complicated people and messy, irrational, complicated information. I don't believe that we have anything approaching the information networks we will have. I don't believe we have anything approaching the search and discovery capabilities that we will have. Google are fond of saying they think they've cracked search maybe 5%. I think they'd be lucky if it's that much as time goes on. So search and discovery are big challenges. And I come back to information. The reason I don't believe this idea that just the more information, the better, is because I was brought up by one of my other mentors in the room, Professor Stephen Heppel, to believe that there were different categories of information. There was data, which is just basic stuff, and there's masses of that around. Exabytes of it, billions of gigabytes of it around. But data only became useful when you put it in some form of context where it made sense to you, and then it became information. It informed you in some shape or form. Data isn't valuable, data is just noisy. I was once asked by a journalist, what do you think about the fact that the BBC says it has 2 million websites? And I said I thought that was a curse, not a boast. Way too much stuff with no relevance isn't that beneficial. Information, however, has some value to me because I can do things with it, and then it allows me to try and turn it into knowledge, and if I'm really, really lucky, to turn knowledge into wisdom. Wikipedia is great for information. The decision to choose that quote is in some way about knowledge. If it turns out to be enlightening in some shape or form in a few years' time, it might turn out that there was some tiny grain of wisdom in there. I'm not saying there is yet, but who can tell? So these notions that information and data have values embedded within them are really important to me because they're what I base the decisions I make creatively on. They're what I base the people I work with on, people who see these kind of distinctions. Go back to the information fundamentalists for a little while. It's really, really easy to see the theory of information and the completeness that the internet appears to give to some kinds of information. But actually the internet is mainly holes. The internet is mainly stuff you don't find. Google is mainly a list of hundreds of millions of search results that are not of interest to you, with some that are marginally less not of interest to you at the top. It's not in any way a system for finding, it's a system for searching. There's a very important difference between finding and searching. Finding, at the moment, mainly involves human beings and a bit of searching. You're much more likely to find something of interest if your friend tells you it's interesting than just by randomly searching Google, or if it's socially bookmarked, or whatever it is. And at the moment, we're in this blended space, and I think the moment is going to last quite a long time. But that doesn't stop information theorists. It doesn't stop theories of all kinds. It doesn't stop the information fundamentalists. And it doesn't stop this thing which I'm going to call the curse of neatness. The idea that you can have a theory, a kind of straightforward little theory that will explain this incredibly complicated environment. Any more, for instance, than it's turning out, or maybe we'll be wrong, but maybe it's not turning out that you could have something called the efficient markets hypothesis, that you could explain stock markets in this rather simplistic way that said, well, as long as everybody has perfect information, you can never beat the market, and there can't be a boom or a bust because we'll all have perfect information. This came out of the Chicago School of Economists in the 70s, since when we know they may not turn out to be as right as they thought they were. Markets just don't work like that, because they're very much more complicated than the simplistic, neat theory. Media's the same. It's not Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan is drawing a rough map, 50 years ago nearly, of what the ecosystem might now look like. You've got a real live experiment every day in the internet that tells you what the market and what the media environment does increasingly look like. So oversimplification is the enemy here. Trying to get a sort of all-encompassing theory that, along the lines of the efficient markets hypothesis, might work for a little while, but in the end I think it's more helpful to think about the issues and to be reflexive about them, to be conscious of them. So let's kill a few of the media buzzwords that float around the place, including in some of the textbooks. Martini media. Who's heard of Martini media? Okay, a few people. Martini media is a kind of voguish term thrown around by predominantly people from broadcasters who kind of have children who've been on the internet. It's a belief that you'll just have all media anytime, any place, anywhere. Now, the people over sort of 35 in the room now understand why it's called Martini media. Everybody else is going, no, what's that about? There was a drink called Martini. There still is a drink called Martini. It comes in terrible bottles, or it's mixed very expensively by bartenders. And there was an advertising campaign with Joan Collins, is that right? With Joan Collins, who was a soap star. That's a kind of actress. Just keep going for a minute. And this was the catchphrase, anytime, any place, anywhere, which I always thought was a bit optimistic. Martini, 6 a.m., just got up, bacon sandwich, martini. It always struck me as being a bit of a strange idea in any case. This is kind of one of the great this is supposed to indicate that you understand the way the media is going if you're from the traditional media industry. The only problem with it is it's arrant nonsense. Because you don't want the same media anytime, any place, anywhere, because it doesn't match what you're doing. It makes a lot of sense if you're distributing media, because it's a great deal better than no time, no place, nowhere, which is the alternative, but it doesn't make much sense as a user. Do you really want to have whatever's being pumped out of a commercial television channel on your phone just at the same time it's being pumped out, because that makes sense for the television channel, or do you want the thing you want? I want the thing I want. It's fairly straightforward. So it's another sort of oversimplification, this idea that just getting technology to be able to take media onto any platform is necessarily good for users. I've lost count of the number of mobile TV trials there have been, the amount of companies that have sort of tried to make these things work just because the technology can do it. Martini media doesn't really help. Third one, almost every technological guru you'll ever read reads way too much science fiction and believes it. But they believe in it as a place, as an endpoint, when I think most science fiction, good science fiction, is incredibly informative about the kind of journey we might be on. But it's not really an endpoint. I'm not that good at physics, but the Matrix seems quite unlikely in the near future. But it tells you quite a lot of useful things about the way in which networks and human societies might be going. Actually, if you want to read stuff that is kind of informative, read the work of Cory Doctorow, who's a sort of technological thinker and science fiction writer who actually works in the technology world now. Or obviously William Gibson, these sorts of guys. But don't think they're trying to describe the world in 2040 or 2050. They're trying to describe aspects of the direction of travel the world might be going in. In fact, many of the good ones are satirists, in the same way that Jonathan Swift was a satirist. They're not trying to describe it. They're trying to undermine our direction of travel by pointing out some of the things we don't know or some of the things that are ridiculous about what we're doing. But actually, quite a lot of technological people believe science fiction. And that's okay, but it doesn't help much in the long run, I don't think. That's facetious, that's that part, by the way, obviously. The other thing that worries me is oversimplification again. What somebody else, not me, called information Newtonianism. Believing that the world is in fact as simple as Newton's description of physics, when in fact the ecosystem of media is more like the chaos theory of Mandelbrot or the quantum theory of Einstein and et al. I'm at that end, and I don't understand any of the physics. But I know it's more complicated than it used to be when you made a television program, distributed it through television channels, and people watched it on a Saturday night. Some of the time, it's more complicated than that. So trying to find simplicity here, I think, is worrying. So another great example of simplicity is what Nicholas Negroponte in Being Digital, one of the kind of founding texts of my world, 1995, Stephen, something like that. Negroponte is professor at MIT. What he called the divide between bits and atoms, or I'm going to call it bits and bricks. This idea that there were completely separate domains. There was digital and there was non-digital. Well, actually, I think you start with the person, you start with the individual. There are never separate domains. There are things you do, some of which are digital, some of which are not digital, and many of which span the two spaces over time. So I went crawling Wikipedia again, like you do for these sorts of things, or like I do. So you can be a professor and just look on Wikipedia for stuff, students. It's good. I went crawling Wikipedia again to try and find sort of ideas around this duality between real life and information. And I found Bertrand Russell, a philosopher, who said he was defining work, which I thought was kind of helpful. Work is of two kinds. First, altering the position of matter at or near the Earth's surface relative to other such matter, moving stuff about. Second, telling other people to do so. Information is telling other people to do so. Bits are moving stuff about. Clearly there are distinctions between these two things, but do they hold up in the digital world as much as the kind of simplicity of that theory might suggest? For the reasons I've said previously, I don't think they do, because I think as human beings, we interact seamlessly between those two spaces. 10 minutes before I came on, I was on Skype with my children, my 3-year-old daughter, in fact, who said earlier on in the day, Daddy, I need to talk to you later on, because she had to show me something she'd made at preschool or whatever it was. And I said, well, I'll phone you. And she said, no, I like to Skype because I can see you, it's better. Which of those, don't say all, although the audience did at the time, actually, because she was on the screen. Which of those is information, which of those is not? She's bringing the real world of observable evidence, looking at stuff, into the digital world. She can't see that distinction. At 3, she wouldn't see that distinction, I suspect, in any case, but she'll never see that distinction in the way that anybody in this room does. It would just not be real for her. And I'm not sure it's as real as we think it is. Is there really a battle or a dichotomy between stuff and information, or not? Well, I think for providers of information, it suits them quite often to perpetuate the idea that there is. That you can have either a DVD or a download. That you can have either a newspaper or a website. I think that's oversimplification again. The fundamental thing for me, and I'll come back to this later, is you need what you need to deliver something of value to you as a user or a participant at that moment. And sometimes, as this morning, that will be a book to read in the bath, and sometimes that will be a much vaunted, imminent Apple book reading tablet or whatever it is, or an iPhone. By the way, that's a phone, of course. It's controlling a presentation. When did that happen? Phones just became things that did things about 2 years ago, didn't they? So for providers of content, particularly, they like the idea that there's a balance between that there's a battle between these two things, mainly because it kind of often reflects their own companies. There often is a battle between the guys in DVDs and the guys in downloading, the download department, because one of them, DVDs, currently makes more money than the other one, and therefore has more sway in the institution. But actually everybody knows that if they don't start to collaborate and think collectively, in the end, all their revenues will fall away. It doesn't stop them arguing amongst themselves, perpetuating this false idea. Because for you as the focus group of one, do you care whether it's stuff or information? You care deeply when it's relevant. You don't care if it's just the most efficient way for a distributor to send you content. It's vastly cheaper, do you know, for Netflix or one of those DVD rental companies to send you a DVD in the post than it is to download it, to allow you to download it. At this point in time, it is cheaper for them to do the post, although of course it might never arrive. It is cheaper for them to do that. So amazingly enough, they perpetuate that model until it makes sense for them to flip to the information model, because the cost of shipping that data will be too high. I don't think it's anything like anything like that simple, that there is a dichotomy, there's a balance, an argument between bits and bricks. Just seems too simple. And why? Well, they're coming back in again because people mess up the theory. We just don't behave rationally about these things. We are essentially irrational more than we like to think we are. That's not bad. It just happens to be more true than the theorists would believe. It doesn't make a lot of sense to keep books at home on shelves when you have read them and will never read them again. It is an irrational act to have your own private library. Doesn't make it wrong or valueless, just not rational. And I think I have 2,000 or 3,000 books. I would count up in this room. There will be many, many hundreds of thousands of books between us. But that is an irrational thing to do. In the context, if it happens, of being able to download every book that's available. Why would you need to keep them? Because they're not just about the information in the books. They remind me of where I was when I read them. They do something wonderful, which is tell people that I've read loads of books when they come to my house. They do something rather interesting when people, whether it's actually games as well, works like that for me. They do something about starting conversations. Used to be albums in the day of some of us in the room. Actually, not me, it was CDs even for me. They have social value. They have social value as social signifiers that steps beyond their rational, functional capabilities. In a way, what we're seeing is a start of a kind of utilitarian argument about things should be useful against an age-old argument with things should be valuable. And sometimes value comes from usefulness. You can have John Stuart Mill and Wittgenstein 100 years ago having that debate, quite 100 years ago, 80 years ago having that debate. Still, Mill would be dead, clearly. Wittgenstein would less so, although equally as incomprehensible to most of us. The other reason people mess it up is we're ignorant. We know almost nothing of everything that is to be known. And how would we make these incredible judgments based on the idea that we have perfect information about things? Nobody has perfect information, and even if you did, you would have it for such a tiny amount of time before circumstances changed that it would be imperfect again. This is obvious stuff, that we don't have these kind of simplicity, these elements of simplicity that can make the theories work. But there's one real problem. The book of the year for me was a book called The Origin of Wealth by a writer called Erich Beinhofer, which is about economics. It's specifically about a branch of economics called evolutionary economics or complexity economics. And Beinhofer's thesis is that we've been misled by the classical economic theory that has been around for so long because it's just more complicated than that. Is that kind of it, really? It's just too interconnected, complex, and what he calls reflexive. One thing happens which affects another thing, which affects another thing, which affects another. Reflexivity is the core tenet of George Soros' writings, the multi-billionaire financier, and actually of Warren Buffett's writings about making vast sums of money. They understand the idea that markets are very complex and somehow, in some form of necromancy, they can ride them. But they don't try to oversimplify them. The media space is like this now. It's complex, it's self-reflexive. Things feed on each other. Ideas feed on each other. Content feeds on content around the network. It isn't this simple, you feed it in, a thing happens, you get a result. I'm not sure it ever was, but it's been described that way for so long. That's Einstein against Newton, complexity against the oversimplified model. And I love the fact that it is irrational, that we are ignorant, and that there is complexity. Thank goodness for that, I say, because if it wasn't, I suspect we wouldn't have any art. I'm fairly sure we wouldn't learn very much, and I'm absolutely positive we'd have no adventure or fun. These are the variables, these are the exciting, confusing things that make it worth being here. Wittgenstein and Mill again. And actually even markets to me seem to prove that these theories don't work. If markets are just really efficient, and they're just about information and the exchange of information, confidence wouldn't matter. Now I've just become involved in a PLC for the first time in my life, a floated company, confidence matters a lot. What people think about you is actually vastly more important, it seems, to your stock price than what you do all day. Confidence matters a great deal. Exuberance, when stocks get overexcited or over-pessimistic, that wouldn't matter. And irrationality wouldn't matter. Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the US Federal Reserve, said in a previous mini bust, as it turned out, that the markets had got irrationally exuberant about .com, about investing in the internet. Well, if they're logical beasts of information, they can't be confident, exuberant, or irrational. And yet, whenever they go wrong, they're described as over-exuberant or irrationally exuberant. And then, logically, therefore, you couldn't have booms and busts, which is clearly evidenced very well by recent history. And what about content? If content was so simple, if content was all there was to media, just getting the idea from my brain to yours, that'd be dead easy. Why would we bother with theatres? Because I could just tell you the story. It'd be straightforward. You bother with theatres because of a shared experience amongst people in a room. You bother with theatres because you as individual members of the audience can make your decision about what you want to focus on, what you want to pay attention to. You don't just go to the theatre to find out the ending. Or if you do, let me tell you, you're missing a few bits about theatre. What about cinemas? I was once asked by an MP, and obviously not a paragon of questing intellectual rigour, how long cinemas had got. And this was I was actually giving evidence at a select committee. And he said, you know about this new technology stuff, how long have cinemas got? And sort of the question made its way into my head eventually. And I thought, I have no idea what he's talking about. And he said, well, because now we've all got plasma screens, enormous plasma screens in our home and surround sound systems. How long have cinemas got? You don't need cinemas. We've got brilliant pictures, brilliant sound. And I had a moment of what they call esprit d'escalier, which is when you don't think of the right thing to say at the time, but you think of it on the way down the stairs, esprit d'escalier, on the way out, which is I wanted to say to him, have you got a kitchen? Do you ever go to restaurants? Why the hell have you got a kitchen then? Because he was doing this sort of techno-utopian thing. Because the technology is great, of course, that will delete out the alternative, which was seen as going to the cinema. I go to the cinema when I go to sit in a room full of 500 people getting thrilled or laughing or whatever it is. And probably because the screen's that bit bigger, because not many of us actually have screens that big. Although, of course, I'm not claiming them on my expenses, so who can tell what size his plasma screen was. But whichever you go, it's a social thing, it's a human thing, it's a messy thing, it's about popcorn, it's about snogging at the back. It is also about the film. This kind of functionalist perspective doesn't help. Just the information in the film. What happens in 2012? Did the Olympics happen in despite of the fact the entire world is collapsing in that film? I don't know. If content was rational, if media was rational, can anybody in the room explain John and Edward to me? Because if it was all about the experience of the content, if it was all about the experience of, let's be honest, absolutely anything at all, apart from the fact that the British love taking the piss out of Simon Cowell and love an underdog and love subverting things that feel self-important and have confused X Factor with Britain's Got Talent, which I think is probably pretty fair, because you tell me the difference between Stavros Flatley and John and Edward, apart from the fact they're on the wrong programme. But whichever ones of those it is, so you don't get John and Edward in professorship letters very often, I hope. Whichever one it is, it's not about just the stuff they're getting across, the idea, the content. Whatever we're doing it as a society or as individuals about them, at least as much as encountering what they're doing. And for me, that's because it's not about content. Where we are now is not about content, it's about experiences that you have, that I have, as a viewer, as a game player, as a participant, as somebody singing in a choir. I'm doing invented a big participatory singing project the BBC are doing at the moment, trying to get 500 scratch choirs to sing the Hallelujah Chorus, using the internet, but singing it in real life. It's about experiences. And experiences for me, and this is only for me, have value when they're personal, when they're meaningful, i.e. when they make some sense for me, when they add something to my life, and that's because I need to value them in one form or another. And that is a personal decision. It's a personal set of circumstances. It isn't something that I will share with everybody. It's something, these are characteristics that some media will sometimes bring together large numbers of people around. And we'll come back in a little while to the overblown death of television. It's a pretty odd medium where 14 million people are watching The X Factor. It's an odd dying medium if 14 million people are watching it on a Saturday and a Sunday night. Television's not going anywhere in some ways, but it's going totally down the drain in others. And as soon as we understand the difference, people in telly might have a chance. But it's about these things, more often than not, that are personal and valuable to me. I suspect many of you watch The X Factor for different reasons to the reasons I watch The X Factor, and that is the way that media consumption and the reading of media experiences always have been. The difference for me now is that we're moving from a position where most of us were essentially in a rationed environment of media, a situation where media was relatively scarce, to the situation we're now in where it is almost ubiquitous. There is so much media around us that the onus is shifting from waiting to be fed media, gratefully waiting with the curtains closed for Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, for an episode of Doctor Who. There's an episode of Doctor Who. I talked to Andrew's in the room, he knows a bit about Doctor Who. I worked on Doctor Who last year for a while. There's an episode of Doctor Who in series 2 or 3 with Maureen Lipman, you're going to tell me which now, in the new series with Maureen Lipman, who infects the nation's televisions on the day of the Queen's coronation. And takes over the televisions. You do know, don't you?
It's called The Idiot's Lantern.
The Idiot's Lantern, thank you. I don't know whether to be proud or ashamed that you know that. Actually, I know which I don't have to be, because I didn't know that. The Idiot's Lantern. And on the day, in 1953 of the coronation, this whole episode takes place. Well, actually, the thing I found most interesting about it, talking to the children of, teenage children and youngish children of friends, was that they were completely mystified by the idea that people would gather around a television programme. Utterly confused them. And people did. People, that's one of my dad's early experiences of television. They had the first colour TV in the street. People came and watched TV in their room. It doesn't have that draw. It doesn't have that mythos. It doesn't have that history. What we do now, instead of waiting for it to be fed, is sometimes it is so enormous. The next coronation of the Queen, of a king, well, it'll be a king, of a king in this country probably, will be bigger than the last in numerical numbers watching television. By a country mile, it will be bigger than the last. But that's because it will be, the characteristics of that event will be so big and unmissable. And we'll come back to this a little bit later, that television will be one of the only ways to do them justice. But actually for most of us, most of our media consumption is about searching out content. It's about seeking out experiences in our lives, online, on TV, at the library, at the football, travelling. We're empowered increasingly to find these things for ourselves. We are doing the filtering. We as users, as people formerly known as the audience, we're doing the filtering now, and that's a very different balance from where we were. One of the great ironies of information economics, which is what this discipline is called, is that while information can be trivially copied and information bandwidth continues to widen, the individual's attention span or bandwidth is as narrow as ever. It's not strictly true in the mathematical sense of how many bits of media can you be present at simultaneously. There's some fascinating research, in fact, which Professor Heppel was involved in, into how much you can pay attention to. The way we spread and direct our attention is changing. You might well be looking at a Twitter stream, surfing the web, radio on the background, television happening, etc. But actually what you'll be doing is switching more quickly because you've only got one focal point. And that's not me, that's the human brain. There are backgrounds, there are things you can do to improve your background processing capability, but you'll only have one focal point of attention. And the key thing is to decide what you don't watch, what you don't listen to in that context. And in that environment, choices are really, really important. Because in an information-rich world, as somebody called Mr. Simon said in 1971, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else, a scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes. What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, the wealth of information creates a poverty of attention, and a need to allocate that attention efficiently among the overabundance of information sources that might consume it. It's too much stuff. And that leads us to the position I think we're in today. As we shift from a situation of scarcity of information to abundance of information, there are essentially two challenges in the digital media age for media professionals and for us as media consumers. Polar challenges, opposite ends of the spectrum. Finding and being found. And finding and being found are essentially descriptions of the getting and giving, or the giving and getting, to be strictly correct, of attention. It's not search, it's not channels, it's finding and being found. Almost every film ever made is watched by almost nobody. Almost every magazine ever printed is read by almost nobody and is known about by almost nobody on the grand scheme of things. Your biggest problem as a creator is not how to make your stuff seen by everybody, it is how to avoid it being seen by nobody. It is a levelling fact of life. In a simple system, it wasn't like that. In a simple system, let's go back to the 1950s in television, attention was quite straightforward. What you had was a situation in which Ed Murrow, the legendary journalist, said, just because your voice reaches halfway around the world doesn't mean you are wiser than when it reached only to the end of the bar. Television could do that. It could amplify you in that way. Television sometimes still can do that. It can amplify people in that way. But actually, just because you had a stranglehold on the distribution or the production didn't necessarily mean you had things worth saying. Just because 28 million people watched Morecambe and Wise on Christmas Day 1977 doesn't mean there was nothing they could conceivably think of watching better. It just means there wasn't a lot else on. Doesn't denigrate from Morecambe and Wise, but it isn't the same as the environment now. Now, some people immediately leap here and say, well, that means loud media, big media, they're dead. Well, that's nonsense. In fact, if anything, right now, loudness is more important than ever. If you're in the big media, if you're in television, the most important thing you can be right now is noticed. If you're loud, loudness is more important than it ever has been. If you own the rights to Formula One, the price of them is going up. If you own the rights to the Premiership football, the price is going up. If you create a massive hit drama, not so much like The Wire because it was a niche hit drama, but a major drama that hits around the world, or a format like The X Factor. I encountered Simon Fuller, one of the people behind The X Factor, the other day. They're suggesting it's worth $1 billion a year now. The value of successful, loud things is much greater than it ever has been because they're more global, they're more instantaneous, they spread across more platforms, you can get money out of them in other ways. Loudness, if anything, is more important than ever. But the problem is, it turns out that a lot of the stuff we thought was important just turns out to have been loud. There's no real scarcity in programs to fill the gap between midday and 3 p.m. Go and look at the schedule of ITV or Channel 4, and then look at the schedule of the same channels in the 1970s. Some of the same programs are showing up in those dead, quiet gaps. Doesn't mean you can't make loud, wonderful things for those spaces, but maybe they're not valuable enough, maybe they're not turning up enough cash. Maybe quite a lot of the problem with television is there's too much of it, rather than that it's not good enough. But that's a difficult thing to say to somebody from television. It's also a difficult thing to say to somebody from newspapers, particularly from the tabloids. We'll come on to, briefly, Rupert Murdoch's announcements about putting paywalls up around newspapers in a little while. I was briefly News International Professor of Media at another university. There's nothing to say about that, I just was. They didn't want to hear this argument. They just didn't want to hear anything about this stuff. And they still don't. And that's fine. Jeff Zucker, NBC Universal, one of the biggest names in television, he said, Google was built on the power of math. I think he meant maths. Math and algorithms. I think he's American. NBC is built on brilliant programming. Both are compelling models, but I don't think Google's model is as powerful as Viacom, blah, blah, and as the market would have you believe. There's one minor problem with that, it's total nonsense. It's trying to compare apples with oranges. It's like saying, oh, well, actually, the water companies who distribute water, which is a necessity of life, have a different model to NBC, but NBC is better. At what? It's not the same thing. That's not to say there is no value in NBC. If you watch 30 Rock or you watch a number of the other things that come out of NBC, you know that they create incredible television from time to time. But to compare it against Google is to take the wrong place. It's to take the wrong point in the argument and then just get it completely wrong. It just doesn't work, that argument, because Google doesn't do what television does. And there's a lot of this around at the moment, unnecessarily urgent in my view, quite often, what the theorists call last gasp theory. just as the technology is reaching its end, it turns out to be quite good at being what it was good at. Just as everybody is worrying about the death of television, some people focus on making great television, and there's some great television around the place. And there will continue to be great television around the place. It's last gasp theory. Surely much better to focus on doing what you were brilliant at well than trying to do the alternative, which is what, for instance, the music industry did for quite a long time, which is to take your old way of operating and bring it into the new world. For instance, by trying to reintroduce scarcity. Once music got free, once we could just download music, once it became something that was on the network, you were never going to win by trying to reintroduce the idea that you would put digital rights management, DRM, onto music, and it would be very, very hard to download that.